friends ever since.
This beautiful camera that I've got in my hands here is the Canon EOS 1DS Mark II. This thing came out in 2005, and at that point it was the pinnacle of digital camera technology. It also had a fairly incredible price tag to match, coming in at around £6,000. And for that reason, back in 2007 or thereabouts, when I was a professional, or at least a semi-professional photographer, there was no way I was ever going to be able to afford one of these things. And actually, even the press photographers that I knew at that point weren't shooting with these. And so fast forward on about 15 years or so, which is kind of awful to think about. But fast forward on to 2022, and I have literally just got one of these for the rather modest sum of £120. Now, you might think that I'm just mad, but you might also see this as a kind of sad testament to the disposable nature of technology, especially when we consider the kind of specs of this thing. So for example, this can shoot at 4 frames per second and also has a maximum ISO of 1600. And when you compare that to something like the Sony ZV-E10, which I'm filming this video on, that consumer level camera, which costs about £500, comes in with 11 frames per second and a maximum ISO of something like 360,000, which, you know, without even looking at any of the other spec, it's kind of incredible to see the difference in technology. So with that said, why did I buy one of these things? To understand that, I have to give you a wee bit of context. First of all, back in the day when I was working as a photographer, I would find myself often in situations like nightclubs or music festivals where I and the camera would end up often covered in various substances, including, but not limited to, beer, piss, and even actually at one festival, somebody threw an aubergine from the crowd into the photo pit, which clattered off of my camera. And I'm not making that up, I've got a photo somewhere. Oh, by the way, that's an eggplant for those of you in America. But needless to say, all of that combined with my youthful exuberance towards alcohol, then my cameras really needed to stand up to quite a lot of abuse. And for that reason, I used to have 2 Canon 5D Mark I's, as in the classic 5D, before there were, you know, different versions of them available. And I had one slung over each shoulder, one had a zoom lens on it and one had a wide angle lens. And over the years, I've come to really rely on just how robust and solidly built those cameras are, even though they're nowhere near as big or as solid as this thing. Now recently, this whole kind of importance of build quality became kind of obvious, or became a bit clearer, because I was back shooting some nightclub stuff and I took my Sony A7 and the Sony ZV-E10 with me. And unfortunately, even though those cameras are so technologically superior to the Canon 5D, I found that there was just no way that I could rely on them, in the sense that if I had them slung over my shoulder and they get clattered off of a door frame or something, which would happen fairly regularly in that kind of environment, then I'm not convinced they would survive. They would very much likely shatter or break in some fashion, whereas I can tell you that the Canon 5D has been thrown down the stairs in the particular club I'm talking about many, many times and still is completely functional. So this got me thinking. Now, I could happily go on shooting indefinitely in clubs and stuff with the 5D for many years. However, there is one kind of flaw with the 5D that I found, and that is that the battery grip, which is basically the big chunky bit at the bottom of the camera, over time, the contacts within the 5D battery grip erode, or within the 5D itself, and that means that it doesn't make a connection. And so the only way you can get your 5D to function after a certain amount of time is to shoot it without the battery grip. And unfortunately, that makes these cameras much less sturdy, much less hefty, because essentially the camera's like cut in half. You don't have this full bit on the bottom. And also, if anyone ever attacks you, you kind of use it as like some kind of, you know, mace to crack them over the head with it. Not that I've ever done that, by the way. So I was looking into alternatives, and I realised that there were all of these older full-frame Canon DSLRs that were now going for relatively good prices, and that's partly why I decided to pick up the 1DS Mark II. The 1DS Mark II is a full frame camera, which is the same as the Canon 5D, and that might not matter normally. However, because I've shot with a full frame sensor in nightclubs and stuff for so long, if I was to drop down to a cropped sensor, I would have to readjust all of my muscle memory, my wide lenses wouldn't be quite as wide. There's a whole host of problems that would come with that, so I definitely wanted to stick with the full frame sensor. The 1DS Mark II is from about the same time as the Canon 5D, and it is also built like a tank. In many ways it's actually built like more of a tank than the 5D was. It's got the battery grip built into the camera itself, which means it's even more solid than the 5D, and there's no risk of those parts failing or the contacts corroding like happened. And in here we have a 17 megapixel sensor, which is more than adequate for what I need to do, and also larger than the Canon 5D, I believe. So what do I actually make of this now that I've been shooting with it? Well, I've actually been really surprised at some of the differences between the 5D and the 1DS Mark II, because there are some significant differences, some which are really good and some which are less good. First of all, there is a 45-point autofocus system within this, which is not present in the 5D, which is great because it means focus is much faster, more accurate, and is just more pleasurable to use. The second thing which is really nice about this is that it takes both compact flash and SD cards, which is really unusual for a camera of that era, and it also means that you can back things up onto them, which is particularly good if, like me, you can, you might be prone to certain accidents. Now, the other thing about this is that the operation of the menu system is quite different, and at first I thought this was pretty good. It made quite a lot of sense. However, it actually is one of the most unintuitive menu systems I've ever used on a camera. You kind of have to select things, you have to use both hands to kind of select things, and it's really nowhere near as nice to use as the 5D's menu system at all. To be honest though, I can't really believe just how good the pictures are from a 16-year-old camera, which ultimately is kind of the main point. Now, in order to give this a real test, I took the 1DS Mark II out to the Cat House Rock Club, where I have worked for many years, and I have been using the same camera setup for all of that time, and I thought I would put it through its paces. Now, unfortunately, even though it feels fucking fantastic in the hand, I realised very quickly that, the way things were set up weren't quite what I had expected, in the sense that when you've been using the same camera for a very long time, or the same equipment for a very long time, you begin to compensate for the various flaws or idiosyncrasies of that equipment. So you'll dial down the flash exposure, or you'll adjust the aperture, or whatever it might be. And to be honest, for the first hour, I couldn't get any good photographs out of this. I kept overexposing things, things didn't seem to be in focus properly, it just really wasn't gelling at all, and this was a big problem because I couldn't really, risk losing money from a night because I wasn't able to operate the camera. And it was also a bit of a shock because I didn't expect that, given that I'd been using the 5D for so long and they should be very similar. However, what I have since discovered was that it wasn't necessarily just compensating for the kind of idiosyncrasies of the particular exposure mechanism within this camera. The screen on this is abysmal. It is worse than an old mobile phone camera screen, or mobile phone screen, I guess. It really is the lowest quality, lowest resolution thing you've ever seen. And in contrast with the 5D, which is a really nice large screen, this wee thing just makes everything look blurry and soft and out of focus. And when I actually got the files onto the computer and looked at them, they were pretty fantastic actually, and I was surprised at just how much sharper things looked, even compared to the 5D, but maybe that would be in my head, I'm not entirely sure. But the results for me were more than good enough for what I was looking for. Now, the biggest problem with this camera is not the kind of crappy screen or anything like that. It is more a much more fundamental issue than that, in that I discovered, after I thought I had got a brilliant bargain of getting this camera for £120, that actually it needs a very specific charger for the batteries. And unfortunately, because I didn't research this in advance, I didn't realise that the charger for this particular camera battery is like gold dust. And when I looked online to try and find them, they were going from everything from £200 right up to £500 from somebody in Japan, which means that this is not quite the bargain that I thought it was in the first place. In the end, what I had to do was look out for some broken cameras on eBay, ones that were seriously destroyed, like they looked like they'd been run over by a truck. And with them, I managed to get this beautiful thing, which is a ludicrously oversized NCE2 battery charger. And the fact that this thing is a proprietary connector and all that is a bit of a nightmare, because it means that if this ever breaks, then I'm fucked, basically. However, it works and I've managed to get it. So with a total cost of about £180, I have my upgraded old 1DS Mark II, and it works fine. Now, the quality of shots that I was getting from the 1DS Mark II was so good that I wanted to try it out with some of my vintage lenses, because I do have quite a large collection of unusual lenses, and I don't really have that many lenses anymore that fit on the Canon EF system, because I sold lots of them when I stopped being a professional photographer. I've basically only got a 20mm f2.8 and a 50mm f1.4, and whilst they're pretty good, they're not the most interesting lenses in the world. Now, I thought I might be able to mount my Canon 50mm f0.95 rangefinder lens on here, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to be possible since it's got an M mount, and you can't get a Leica M to Canon EF mount, unfortunately. However, I did discover that I can mount all of my M42 lenses onto this. You need a flangeless M42 to EOS adapter. That's important, because if there's a flange on it, it won't work properly. And I could also mount a whole bunch of my M39 lenses, including the dream lens's wee cousin, the 50mm f1.2. Now, the chunky body of the 1DS Mark II means that I'm also able to use some really much heavier and bigger lenses, like my Helios 40-2 85mm f1.5, which has just been too bulky to use with my Sony a7. And I guess now I just need to find some people to shoot it with, because I've kind of run out of any motivation to take photos at this point. To sum up, buying a Canon EOS 1DS Mark II in 2022 in some ways is a bit of a ridiculous thing to do. However, in other ways, it's actually the smartest thing you could possibly do, because not only are these cameras more than capable of performing in really kind of demanding, challenging environments where they're going to get bashed about and clattered off walls or dropped on the floor or whatever, but they also still stand on their own when we're talking about image quality. You don't need to have a 48 megapixel camera with ultra fast autofocus or anything like that. You do need a camera that is reliable, that will produce quality, sharp images, and especially if you're using flash and you don't need to worry too much about high ISO performance. Something like this for 120 or 180 pounds, if you have to hunt down the charger separately, is a bit of a bargain. In many ways, I feel like it is a big step up from the Canon 5D, but in many ways it's also kind of a step down because of its various quirks and the stupid charger and the terrible display screen and all that kind of thing. However, I'm really glad that I picked one of these up, particularly because I can use it with my older lenses, and actually the results I'm getting from it are brilliant. And so if you're looking for a really interesting, kind of capable camera, to take photos with, not just to kind of produce content for the internet, then yeah, I would consider the 1DS Mark II. Just remember to make sure you get one of these chargers. Anyway, thanks for watching. I know this kind of vintage digital camera market or niche is extremely limited, but hopefully there'll be other people out there that are curious about this thing, or maybe have one and can tell me how to use it properly. Until next time, goodbye.